So I don't want to feel like too much of a bandwagon jumper since the rank stupidity of the make-believe outrage against fake geek girls has been thoroughly raked over the coals by pretty much every noteworthy voice out there, but it's come up again recently and it kind of ties into the overall subject of these next few episodes I was going to do, and I really do feel the need to weigh in, if for no other reason than to ask the outraged parties in question why this should even theoretically be such a big deal. I mean, guys, even if I was to pretend, just for the sake of argument, that there really is this horrible epidemic of beautiful women pretending to be into this or that subculture just for attention, which is apparently some kind of tangible, quantifiable, precious resource in your reality, instead of this just being the latest way for sexually insecure quote-unquote men to keep their sandbox free of the cooties, which is what it is, by the way. But if there really are these fiendish, scheming, fake geek girls running around out there only pretending to be the real thing, why would you be mad about that? I mean, carried to its logical conclusion, wouldn't the existence of the fake geek girl mean that you, quote-unquote, real geek guys and whatever it is you're into are now so cool, so hip, so trendy, so massively dominant of the popular culture that the beautiful people now want to be seen as you? Shouldn't that be a win if you're so concerned about reality and integrity of your That's what I'd be asking if I was an angry man, of course, but instead I'm given to be introspective. After all, if 31 years as a real geek guy has taught me anything, it's that things have never been easy for the girls who just want to wear capes. And that, my friends, is what we call a topical segue. So then, Supergirl. Supergirl is confusing. I mean, Supergirls are usually confusing and comics are weird. But Supergirl probably holds the record for having the easiest character to explain. I mean, it's kind of right there in the costume, Superman but with a girl, with the hardest existence to explain. But all that confusion comes from her being one of the longest-lived female characters in comics, and as such, the various permutations that the winds of change have put her through can be used like the rings of a tree to track the way said culture has historically treated both women and the concept of womanhood within its borders. First things first, by my count there have been about 6 or 7 official incarnations of Supergirl. 2 or 3 of these incarnations are actually the same character depending on how you look at it, and the number actually gets higher if you count various similar characters who got test runs in the various Superman books before she officially appeared. That'll kinda make sense by the end of all this, but for now we'll start at the beginning. The original Golden Age DC Universe Supergirl was created by a writer named Otto Binder, who is also credited with the creation of the 2 other female counterpart to a male hero characters who'd come before her, Mary Marvel and Miss America. Binder is one of the great legends of the Gold and Silver Age of comics who doesn't get nearly enough recognition today, mostly because he tended to specialize in the kind of decidedly more whimsical material that several decades of gritty modern fandom have tried to memory hole out of existence. For example, he also created or co-created Beppo the Super Monkey, Titano the Super Ape, and Krypto the Super Dog, along with more enduring fixtures like the Phantom Zone, Brainiac, and the Legion of Superheroes. The first real Supergirl was Kara Zor-El, age 15. Debuting in 1959's Action Comics number 252, Supergirl is the last survivor of Argo, a city of Krypton that had survived the planet's explosion and was set adrift in outer space. But then everyone died of radiation poisoning anyway because their soil, like every other blown-off chunk of Krypton, eventually turned into kryptonite. Kara survived because her father Zor-El, the brother of Superman's father Jor-El, had a spare rocket, and her mom had discovered that Kara's cousin Kal-El was in fact Superman. Armed with this knowledge, they made her a Superman-style outfit, so yes, Supergirl is literally wearing a sexy Superman costume fit for a convention, and shoot her down to Earth. Now, you'd think Superman would be kind of psyched to finally meet a fellow Kryptonian who's not trying to kill him, or at the very least bummed out that the only female member of his species is also his first cousin, but this is 50s Superman, so he's immediately thinking about how to keep everything tidy. See, he's concerned that since Kara is only just getting to Earth and thus only just getting superpowers, she can't be allowed to jump right into the hero game, which is reasonable, I guess, but he's also thinking she shouldn't reveal her true self or her connection to him at all because, well, more or less because a teenage girl is just too emotional and undisciplined to keep either of their identities secret. Yeah, like I said, 50s Superman. Anyway, as part of this whole keep it on the down low routine, instead of taking his 2-time apocalypse survivor blood relative to live with him in his fabulous ice castle, Superman puts her up in an orphanage, with a fake name and a backstory. Instead of putting on glasses like Clark Kent, Kara puts on a brunette wig to become Linda Lee. This would be the setup for most of the early Supergirl stories, most of which can be summarized as Nancy Drew, but she can bench press a continent, which typically ran as backups in the main Superman books. It's often said, not incorrectly, that Superman stories from this era can get kinda boring after a while, not necessarily because he's too powerful as people often claim, since even then the DC universe was crawling with guys who could beat him up. Instead, I tend to find it's because he's just too good. DC was very conscious of Superman standing as a role model for young boys, so he kinda always had to be morally upright and always in the right. Supergirl, on the other hand, was allowed to make mistakes, act out, screw up, etc., like when she accidentally created Streaky the Supercat, officially to help maintain the orphanage cover story by preventing herself from being adopted, but it also kind of feels like maybe because, again, this was the 50s and early 60s, she was a teenaged girl, and those kind of behaviors were basically expected of her by the overwhelmingly male writers and editors. Now, product of its time or not, yeah, that's pretty sexist when you get right down to it, but paradoxically, it made a lot of her adventures more interesting than her male counterparts. While Superman was stopping meteors and being an upright citizen, Supergirl had to navigate the social scene, deal with personal jealousy, clean up her own messes, get in over her head, etc. Plus, it was fun to see Superman occasionally being cast in the role of a stuffy, disapproving 50s dad figure. In hindsight, it's easy to see both these stories and the Superboy prequel comics as early forerunners of the teen drama but with superpowers characters that would dominate the market a few decades later and dominate all of young adult fiction today. Eventually, they did get her out of that situation, though. She got adopted by a nice couple, changing her name to Linda Danvers, and shortly thereafter, Superman allowed her to come out to said parents as Supergirl, and then for Supergirl to come out to the world as existing. Eventually, she got her own books and even got to age, which most comic characters don't. Editorial oversight? Intentional breaking of the mold? Maybe. Or maybe making her not a 15-year-old made it okay for them to start drawing her in hot pants. Though that's nothing compared to when she started dressing like this. Oh yeah, that's Power Girl. I'll explain how that works next time. I'm Bob, and that's The Big Picture. So, last week we went over the basic background of one Kara Zor-El, alias Linda Danvers, alias Linda Lee, alias Supergirl. Pretend orphan of planet Earth, real orphan of planet Krypton, cousin to and four-time secret backup weapon of the Man of Steel. As we left off last time, Supergirl had gone from having an interesting 60s to coming into her own as an individual character in the 70s. But as you may already know, something else was coming into its own in DC Comics of the 70s. Now, we've been over this a few times, but just in case, very briefly, after a one-off Flash story revealing that the Golden Age DC superhero stories that ran from the 30s to the 50s had actually taken place in a parallel dimension on Earth 2, which was just like mainstream Earth 1, except that the members of the Justice Society had first appeared during World War II, meaning they were all about 2 decades or older than their Earth 1 counterparts, and as such had changed a bit. Superman was going gray, Flash still had his funny hat, Batman was retired and then dead, and Supergirl? Well, Supergirl of Earth 2 grew up. Okay, you'll recall from last time that the original Supergirl, though she arguably had more dimensionality as a character than her older male cousin, was a very 1950s, early 60s archetype and of an occasionally troublemaking but otherwise entirely proper good girl. Since the whole point of the Earth 2 stories was letting the writers take established characters in new directions, it was decided that Earth 2's Kara Zor-El would become a tougher, more headstrong and assertive character, chiefly by embracing militant feminism, as understood by male comic book writers anyway, to a degree that would even raise Wonder Woman's eyebrows. Although given that Wonder Woman is an Amazon, that probably wasn't the only thing about Supergirl that had that effect. Oh, come on, I'm allowed to make one bad joke at least, ain't I? Anyway, in the spirit of all that, Earth 2 Kara had renamed herself Power Girl in order to establish herself as a wholly independent entity from her cousin and distaff counterpart. This was more or less Power Girl's shtick as part of Earth 2's superhero community, getting in the other heroes' faces about their own perceived sexism and bludgeoning bad guys while lecturing them on the dangers of underestimating a female opponent. And, of course, doing so while sporting the biggest, damn it, I just used up my one bad joke a minute ago, didn't I? Crap. Okay, make your own Rob Liefeld gigantic guns and comic books joke, I guess. But yeah, there's no getting around this one. Power Girl's proportions have pretty much always been pretty ridiculous, and it can't be ignored that most of her costumes throughout the years have featured what you can't really call anything other than a boob window, where most DC heroes usually just keep their insignia. Believe it or not, they've actually tried to explain and justify this choice of attire in the context of her empowered philosophy. Apparently, at one point, her teammates offered to make her a symbol of her own, and she was furious to discover that what they'd made was just a modified but recognizable Superman symbol, which was the exact image she'd been trying to get away from. So she just leaves a big old empty hole right there to make a point. Yeah, and you thought this was a confused take on feminism. In more recent stories, they've retconned the window to be everything from an intentional attempt to distract her opponents to a symbolic representation of her own personal insecurity, i.e. she feels like she's missing a piece of herself. But really, as you can probably tell, the real reason she's costumed as such is because it's eye-catching, sells comics, the presumed mostly male readership generally always liked it, and the definitely mostly male authors and artists obviously liked it. So it endured, and it might have even saved her life. I'll explain, don't worry. See, by the early 1980s, all the fun that DC had been having making, populating, and carrying on their multiple alternate Earths had also created a universe of heroes that some found entirely too confusing. As also mentioned here a few times already, they attempted to streamline this with 1986's Crisis on Infinite Earths mega-series, in which everything got smashed together into a single timeline and a lot of heroes died so that we'd know how high the stakes were. One of those heroes was Kara Zor-El, Supergirl. The 80s had not been kind to her. Her solo series was cancelled for low sales right around the time her live-action movie was released, and then the movie turned out to be a legendarily awful box office bomb. DC was basically running out of reasons to keep her around outside of guest appearances, and since a big part of the planned post-crisis reboot of the Superman series was to reinforce his last son of Krypton status by eliminating pretty much all other Krypton-originating characters from continuity, Supergirl had to meet her end. To DC's credit, they at least gave her a major send-off, going out in a blaze of glory and saving Superman with her final sacrifice. The image of her dead body is still the most iconic image of the entire crisis. Hell, it might be the iconic image of that entire moment in comics. 1986 also saw the publication of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, both of which inadvertently signaled the rise of the Dark Age of comics. And if you want one image to summarize that, the universal icon of the superhero cradling the bloody, lifeless corpse of his more innocent, fun-loving counterpart will pretty much do. So yeah, the original Supergirl died in 1986. But what about the one-time Supergirl of Earth 2? Well, the Crisis blinked Earth 2 out of existence, but some of its characters were inexplicably allowed to still exist on the new singular Earth, and Power Girl was one of them. Why? Well, because like I already said, DC liked the character, and they really liked being able to publish eye-catching books with her on the cover. So Power Girl lived on, saved from oblivion by pretty much her boob window, but with a succession of hastily thrown together new origin stories that made her something other than Kara Zor-El, who was never supposed to have existed anymore. They never really settled on a good one, though, and they eventually stopped trying until 2005's Infinite Crisis revealed that the original Crisis could yet be undone and that she still had been Kara Zor-El of Earth 2 all this time. I'm not sure if that's still the case after Final Crisis, Flashpoint, and the New 52, but frankly, I don't care, because these things are happening way too damn close together now, and it'll probably just go back that way soon enough anyway. Either way, immediately post-Crisis, the DC Universe was without a Supergirl for the first time since 1959, but it didn't stay that way for long. I'm Bob, and we'll pick that up next time. Last week, or rather in 1986's Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC Comics' original Supergirl died. It was a major turning point in the history of comic book superheroes. Characters generally didn't get killed, certainly not the nigh-immortal demigods of Krypton, and that level of violence against women, particularly a good girl character like Kara Zor-El, was still pretty shocking at the time. This was DC throwing down the gauntlet, saying this is the new normal, stakes are high, changes happen and we stick to them. For a little over 2 years, anyway. Killing off Supergirl during Crisis was a lead-in to a full reboot of Superman's history and status quo by superstar writer-artist John Byrne, which jettisoned a lot of the old mythology at first and gradually worked some of it back in, albeit in new, modernized forms as it went. In issue number 16, one of those revivified fragments of mythos turned out to be Supergirl. Sort of. Briefly, in a pocket dimension, which is what DC had to call alternate universes now that they were supposed to have sworn off using them, where Superman had never existed, new versions of General Zod and company were tearing up the place but met resistance from a shape-shifting artificial being called Matrix, who was created by the pocket dimension's good version of Lex Luthor and liked to default into looking like a female Superman. Things go south, she tried to recruit our Superman to help out, eventually she winds up stuck in our dimension, bing bang boom, now there's a new Supergirl. And people didn't really care all that much. Oh, DC liked being able to make more Superman-branded merchandise for the female market again, definitely, but the readership never really fell in love with Matrix, and the books didn't find much use for her outside of using shape-shifting powers as an occasional plot device. Before and during the 1990s Death of Superman event, which I'm not getting into right now, she eventually started dating the supposedly not-as-evil son of Lex Luthor. Keep in mind, her dimension's Lex Luthor was basically Matrix's father. Ew. Oh, and Lex Jr. was actually just original Lex Luthor in a younger cloned body. Ew. Amazingly, even the prospect of paying all that drama off couldn't make people care about Matrix Supergirl. So DC tried again, letting popular writer Peter David go nuts and give her a new status quo. The resulting series was pretty excellent, but didn't really get its due at the time, probably because it was just so damn bizarre. In Peter David's story, Matrix starts having an existential crisis about her own personhood that gets even more complicated when she merges bodies and minds with a dying girl named, wait for it, Linda Danvers. A little on the nose, but it allowed the series to get about its goal of gradually making Matrix into something more like a modern version of classic Silver Age Supergirl and the version who was gaining popularity as part of Superman the Animated Series. And then things got weird. What else would you expect from the writer who once turned the Incredible Hulk into a gray-skinned mafia enforcer? The story soon revealed that merging with a human had transformed Matrix into an angel. No, not metaphorically, like a literal angel. with fire powers. Things went all cosmic and got pretty damn dark for a while, and eventually the bad parts of Matrix personality separated from Linda Danvers' Earth Angel entity and went on walkabout, leaving Linda as more or less a canonical DC Universe version of the animated series character in a critically acclaimed book that just wasn't drawing any readers. The series ended with a storyline that in hindsight served as a warning shot for DC's bigger upheavals to come. A malevolent force caused the original Silver Age Kara Zor-El's escape rocket to land in the present DC universe, where she never existed, and after some confusion, her and the present-day Linda Danvers eventually traded universes. Linda enjoyed living it up in the happier, more innocent old-school DC universe, and even decided to tell Silver Age Superman that they should totally hook up because, hey, she's not his cousin, and they do. Aw, look, even Batman is happy for them. And check out sobbing, dejected Lois Lane and Lana Lang over there. Brutal. But it turned out that if they didn't switch back, the universe was going to collapse on itself, forcing Linda to abandon her husband, their child, and condemn the Kara Supergirl to her intended death in the Crisis, all of which left her tore up enough that she hung up her cape and that was that. Though Peter David likes to not so subtly at all hint that she actually became the title character of his own creator-owned non-DC series, Fallen Angel. In 2003, another new Supergirl appeared. Her name was Sir-El. She claimed to be Superman and Lois Lane's daughter from the future. Nobody cared. I'm not letting this get to 4 episodes, so moving on. In the early 2000s, one of the big operating motives of DC's editorial and writing staffs was getting as much of the pre-Crisis and Silver Age back into the mainstream DC universe as they could, but in ways that wouldn't overcomplicate things too much this time around. And one of the first triggers to get pulled just before the full rollout of that plan with Infinite Crisis happened in the pages of Superman Batman. Short version, a meteor crashed, and inside Superman found, yes, Kara Zor-El, his cousin from Krypton. Same basic origin as the first one. Superman's happy to see her. Batman doesn't trust her. Wonder Woman thinks she can help. Darkseid wants her for his own purposes. Pretty good story, made a pretty good animated movie. Bottom line, 20 years later, more or less the original model Supergirl was back in the picture once again. And even after New 52's relaunch, she's still there. And so ends the tale of Supergirl, which is also the tale of basically what it means to be a female character in comic books. At least until DC decides to f*** around with it again. I'm Bob, and next week, something other than Supergirl. For real, we're done. I don't care if you're still confused. We're done. Yeah, I know there was a version on Smallville. Don't care. Smallville was terrible. Yes, even when the JSA showed up. Bottom line, no more Supergirl. Done. All done. Seriously.